Well, hello and welcome again to our devotions that we're having at Christ Baptist Church, our daily devotions going through the book of Ezra. And we've been making our way from Daniel to Esther to Ezra, as we've covered many other books of the Bible as well. We've been in Ezra chapter 1 now through chapter 9. We're in the last chapter of Ezra and trying to complete this book. And by the way, when you go through these devotions, it's helpful. You get noting certain dates and names and things that are going on. It'll help you really get an idea of the history of Israel as they were taken captive in Babylon to the exile in Babylon. And then when they were released under the decree of Cyrus and left in 538 BC, we see that in Ezra chapter 1. They make their way with some difficulty. We saw chapters 1 through 6 talk about the difficulties from when they were released 538 BC all the way down to the building of the temple, completing the temple in 520. So it took about 18 years, actually more like 22 years before they actually, from the time they left Babylon to be able to have a completed temple. We saw that through to chapter 6. And then chapter 7, 8, 9 took us literally all the way to the time of Ezra, beginning of the time of Ezra at 457 BC. So quite a while, really some 60 years or so from when the temple was completed, and about 80 years from when they left to go to Babylon. So we see quite a bit of time elapsed going under Ezra. Now, Ezra made his way to Jerusalem there at 457 BC. We see him leaving in chapters 7 and 8 and 9 then. What we saw yesterday in our devotion is it became known to Ezra that the people had married foreign women, and that was just going completely against the law, and what Ezra's response there and dealing with mixed marriages. And now we finally end up with chapter 10 and saying the conclusion of this before we get to Nehemiah, which is in that same time frame. And before we actually get to Ezra, I want to put this verse in your mind of Paul in Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7, actually in verse 7, Paul talks about the law of God, specifically the law of God, and he's been talking a lot about being released by the law in grace and living in grace. And Paul raises this very important argument. He says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. So, when we read the law, our knowledge of sin gets heightened, comes alive, because we begin to understand the character of God, and we know our actions, our thoughts, our hearts. And now we begin to know what sin is because we understand the heart of God and understand the mind of God. And that's what the law does, is it arouses in us the sin that's in us. Why? Well, because we are seeing who God really is, and we know that we are not really matching up to that, and it's very dangerous to be in that standard. It's kind of like when you get reading the law and being in around the law and seeing the character of God. It's like being in the sun too long and getting sunburned. You don't notice it when you're out there. You feel warm and all of that, but when your skin begins to get red, it's when I begin to see that. I begin to say, oh, I now see that, and I see that I'm not able to stand in the presence of the sun, so I need to get out. See, the law does that. The law tells us that we are not holy. It stirs up in our mind what sin really is. And that's why the law is good. It tells us who God really is. It tells us what God really thinks of sin. It's a great warning mechanism for us. Well, with that in mind, remember Ezra was a scribe. He was well versed in the law of God, and he set his mind to study so that he would apply it to himself, and then he would teach it. And he was a teacher of the law. And what we'll see here in chapter 10, it actually gives us the dating of this. And I said yesterday that chapter 9 began with sometime later after they had completed the journey in 457. But it wasn't that much longer. We'll see that in chapter 10. Let's just get to the story, shall we? In chapter 10, verse 1. Now while Ezra was praying and making confession, weeping and prostrating himself before the house of God, a very large assembly, men, women, and children, gathered in from Israel, for the people wept bitterly. So Ezra is dealing with his own concern for the sin of the people and having married all the foreign people, and so the people now are sensing from Ezra's teaching there's something very, very wrong with this. So while Ezra's praying and he's confessing and he's weeping, the people are coming up to him and they're weeping bitterly. And a particular man, verse 2, Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, one of the sons of Elam, said to Ezra, "We've been unfaithful to our God and have married foreign women for the peoples of the land. Yet now there is hope for Israel in spite of this." And so Ezra was aware of it, but now we have somebody coming doing very specific confession. A man named Shechaniah, one of the sons of Elam. That name will factor in later in the chapter. But he said, "We have been unfaithful to our God and married foreign women from the peoples of the land." But there's hope. The law tells us there's hope. See, the law doesn't just condemn. When we understand who God is, there's hope for Israel in confession and going back to the covenant. So verse 3, "So now let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. If we adhere to the law, God will return and be faithful in his covenant with us." That's with the covenant with Israel. And so they're saying there is hope when you turn to God. There's always hope when you turn to God. So they tell Ezra, verse 4, "Arise, for this matter is your responsibility, but we'll be with you. Be courageous and act." So they're looking for Ezra to lead. They're looking for Ezra to lead with the law, and let's implement the law. So verse 5, "Then Ezra arose and made the leading priests, the Levites, and all Israel take oath that they would do according to this proposal." So they took the oath. So it begins with the leadership. Ezra began with the leadership. He had the leading priests, the Levites, and all Israel. They took an oath. It doesn't begin with just individual people. The leaders have to model what's going on. Verse 6, "Then Ezra rose from before the house of God and went into the chamber of Jehohanan, the son of Eliashib. Although he went there, he did not eat bread nor drink water, for he was mourning over the unfaithfulness of the exiles." He was fasting. He was really in prayer to try to understand what to do here, because this is a very complicated situation. The people had married foreign women when Ezra got there. See, what we're going to see in a few verses, it's actually still 457 BC. It's just later in the year, months later, that this came to his attention. This is what had been going on all this time under Zerubbabel and under the high priest that was there. Well, verse 7, "After they had this fasting, they made a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem to all the exiles that they should assemble at Jerusalem." Verse 8, "And that whoever would not come within 3 days, according to the counsel of the leaders and the elders, all his possessions should be forfeited, and he himself excluded from the assembly of the exiles." And that sounds pretty harsh, but remember, the king gave orders to Ezra that everybody must follow Ezra's teaching. Everybody who does not is to be excluded and is taken out. And so we see this. The king says here in Ezra chapter 7, verse 26, "Whoever will not observe the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed upon him strictly, whether for death or for banishment or for confiscation of goods or for imprisonment." So there it is. There was a law that the king gave Ezra. Says you have authority to make sure you enforce the law of God. So he's not only under God's law, but the king is expecting him to follow through with what God had said. So if you don't come within 3 days, it means you are refusing the counsel of your community, of your religious community of Israel. So verse 9, "So all the men of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month on the 20th of the month. So very specifically, not just the 9th month, but on the 20th day of the 9th month. Well, this is 4 months later from when Ezra had arrived on the 1st of the 5th month into Jerusalem. So it's fairly quickly. Ezra found out this is going on. And so we see that it was the 9th month and the 20th month, and all the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of the matter and the heavy rain. It was just raining because it was the rainy season. Now it's cold. They're concerned, and they understand there's a great sin that the law has revealed. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You've been unfaithful and have married foreign wives, adding to the guilt of Israel. Now therefore make confession to the Lord God of your fathers and do his will, and separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives." That's why there's so much praying and fasting. What do you do? And what do you do with the foreign wives? And what if there's children? God hates divorce. We understand this. Yet there was a provision for divorce. Deuteronomy 24 verse 1. There was a provision for divorce in Israel. Not that God said we want to make this part of society. Jesus answers the Pharisees to this very question, is why would Moses permit divorce? Because of the hardness of your hearts. God put a provision of divorce in there because the people had a worse sin, which is hardness of heart. It's actually worse than divorcing your wife. Divorcing your wife is protecting her from your hardness of heart. And so there's a dilemma going on here. Now what do? Do we not provide for these Canaanite women? Or do we let them stay in and defile the whole community? Pretty tough decision. Verse 12, that all the assembly replied with a loud voice, "That's right, as you have said, so it is our duty to do. But there are many people, it is in the rainy season, and we are not able to stand in the open, nor can the task be done in 1 or 2 days. For we've transgressed greatly in the matter." There is open confession here, what they're saying. They're acknowledging what the law has said. They're saying this is absolutely right. We've intentionally gone against God's law. And we can't just do this in 1 or 2 days, so it's going to have to be a bit longer. So they have a suggestion to speed it up. "Let our leaders represent the whole assembly, and let all those in our cities who have married foreign wives come at appointed times, together with the elders and judges of each city, until the fierce anger of our God on account of this matter is turned away from us." So what they're doing here is very wise. You see, God has given us instructions, principles to deal with, but exactly how we do each individual case, he's working through the leadership, working through the leaders of Israel, working through the priests and the Levites to interpret and say, here's the best counsel we can give. Much like the same way God has done that in the church, in the New Testament age. In the church, we have a church with leadership and elders who are supposed to be men who study the Word and pray, and we understand the will of God through His Word. And when sins come up and there's complicated, sticky situations, everything's not just a simple black and white. We try to help the people navigate through there so we can arrive at a situation that pleases God and allows His blessing to come on all people and all parties there. And so in this case, what they're doing is, let our leaders represent the whole assembly, but let those in the cities who have married foreign wives, in other words, don't make the entire nation come and listen to this. Only deal with the people who've actually transgressed, only had the foreign wives, and let them come together so we don't plug up the whole city and make a big mess and everybody has to stand around in the rain. But only let those people come together with the elders and the judges of each city. So very specific, one by one, deal with each case. You don't deal with the whole case like saying you all are corrupt. No, that's not right. You can't make blanket statements. There's always a problem when people want to create some kind of a group identity. All of you have sinned. All of you are guilty of this. God doesn't do that. He says each one is guilty if they've done something. But if there's somebody in the group that hasn't, they're not going to be condemned. And we, the church, should not condemn them. Secular society wants to do that. They want to cast blame across a whole group of people. that's satanic. That's just sinful actions. So they dealt with this one by one. Verse 15, only Jonathan the son of Asahel and Jezeah the son of Tikva opposed this, with Meshullam and Shabbathai, the Levites, supporting them. So there was this small group of people here, very small, saying, we disagree. We don't like what you're doing. It could be that they don't like the 3-day proposal. It could be they don't like the idea of putting away foreign women. We don't know exactly what their argument was, but it's documented here that there was some minor opposition. But they went with the leadership, verse 16, but the exiles did so. And Ezra the priest selected men who were heads of fathers' households for each of their fathers' households, all of them by name. So they convened on the first day of the 10th month to investigate the matter. Let's check out each individual person. Sin is not corporate. There's not a corporate group you identify with because you're of a particular group, so therefore you bear their sin. That is not what the Bible teaches. Everyone's responsible for their own individual sin. There's so much that people do that, and they do that to try to gain power wherever they can. And they try to just say, this group is responsible. We've just seen such atrocities over the centuries when that happens. It's what happened when Germany said the Jews are responsible for Germany's economic collapse and its problems, and so therefore Hitler took the Jews as a corporate group and said, we will now persecute them and try to kill them, exterminate them. Nero tried to do that with Christians under Rome. He tried to say, oh, they're all responsible, they all tried to burn Rome, so let's go get them. So we see that throughout history, people groups looking and saying, how do we ascribe guilt just because you're with them? No. If you are guilty in sin, come before the Lord, and the law will help you deal with that. And that's what Ezra did. He applied the law, but individually to each one. That's what they were saying. To help them understand the blessings and benefits of complying with the law and getting in line with God. And so they finished investigating all the men who had married foreign wives by the first day of the 10th month. So they took some time to do that. It was on the 20th day of the 9th month. So now it was essentially 11 days later that they finished their investigation. And they understood who had to put away their foreign wives. It was a tough decision. Tough decision. I can't stand in judgment of their decision here, but they're wrestling with these different aspects of God's law. And we're going to see in the book of Nehemiah, it was more than just you married the wrong person, you need to divorce them. There was more going on than that. Because what we're going to see under Nehemiah and eventually the prophet Malachi, who factors into this as well, the people actually divorced their original wives so that they would marry the foreign women. So there's a bigger issue at stake. It's not just simply, oh, as a 20-year-old you married the wrong person. No, not so much. But we're going to see that again in Nehemiah as it comes. But here what we see is Ezra found this, and he had to make a decision between, do I allow them to divorce? Or do I say, no, you can't, because God hates divorce, so therefore what we need to do is you need to stay married, just come into community, but then you violate Deuteronomy 7. See, there's big issues at stake. And they apply leadership and the principles of what's going to be healthy for the community. But I want to show you how deep the sin ran in verses 18 to 44. Just a couple of names to chase down. Verse 18 in particular. Among the sons of the priests who had married foreign wives were found of the sons of Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brothers, Messiah, Eleazar, Jerib, and Gedaliah. Now why is that important? Who are these folks? Well, the sons of Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, is important. Why? Because Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, is the high priest. He is the high priest. And not only that, we can see him, you can make a little note in your Bible, he is described in Ezra chapter 5. Ezra chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, when Ezra's writing and talking about what happened when they built the temple in 520 BC. So we're talking about pretty close to 65 years when Ezra was there. Notice there is, when the prophets Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah, Jerusalem, in the name of God of Israel who was over them, then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak arose and began to rebuild the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. Jeshua the high priest was there when they built the temple 520 BC. It's now 457 BC. It's now been 63 years he has been the high priest. That's been the high priest a long time. Jeshua the priest. And there we see him right there, the sons of Jeshua, the son of the high priest, and his brothers. This means the family of the high priest have all married foreign women. They could have been married a long time. There was corruption going deep all the way to the high priest. And this is the same high priest that's found in Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 to 10, and through the book of Zechariah, which again was during the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah. So a high priest has been there for a long time talking about this, and he had a deep sin going on in his family. And either he was unaware or he didn't care. One of the two things. But the law and the preaching of the law through Ezra brought it out, and the people confessed, and the people all came forward and did this. Now, notice in verse 18, sons of the priests who married foreign wives were found, and there they are, sons of Jeshua the son of Jozadak and his brothers. There they are. But look at verse 19. Look what the law does. They pledged to put away their wives, and being guilty, they offered a ram of the flock for their offense. There's no telling how long they'd been married. No telling how long they'd adopted these foreign customs into Israel when Ezra came in. Point is, it doesn't matter how old the sin is. When it comes up and it convicts, and it now is in the way of worship, and it's in the way of that. Because this isn't like a private sin. Like saying, oh, you lied 40 years ago. Or you did something 40 years ago. No, this is saying you married a foreign woman 40 years ago, and she's still with you. And you're now violating God's law of what's going on, and all what's been going on, which includes how you've been worshiping, how you've been putting up with these different religions. You see, that's why everything went case by case to the elders. Because if the foreign wife had become a Jew and said, I forsake where I've come from, and I'm now a Jew, that's a different story. Because God said you will not intermarry with these women, because they'll entice you to go after foreign gods. But if those women turn and say, no, I want to follow Yahweh, the God of Israel, like Ruth, the Moabitess, that's a different story. God says, I'll accept everyone who comes in to worship me. But not those who want to come in and worship other gods and still be with me. That's not going to happen. You can't come in and have the worship of God and want the blessing of God and still hold on to your sin and justify it like it's an okay thing. We're all sinners. Israel was a sinner. They all understood this. But when you hold on to your sin and say, no, God will accept me in my sin, now he says, you're outside the assembly. It's when you acknowledge your sin and are willing to take the hard road, the difficult road of just letting go and saying, God, I'm going to trust God on this path. Many of our sins are so deep into us, it's difficult to let go. Well, they did. They put away their wives and they offered a ram for the flock of offense. Another name down here in verse 26 of the sons of Elam, Mattaniah, Zechariah, Jehiel. Well, Jehiel's related to this guy in verse 2 who came up to Ezra, Shechaniah the son of Jehiel. What are the sons of Elam said to Ezra? Well, actually, Jehiel, the father of this guy Shechaniah. Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, the son of him, his father was married to somebody. So all all these people are listed. Many of them are the people that are listed in chapter 2 that came up under Zerubbabel. So this thing had been going on for some time. And verse 44 gives us a conclusion. All these had married foreign wives, and some of them had wives by whom they had children. A very complicated, sticky mess. Dealing with the wives, dealing with the children. Ezra here does not tell us how they dealt with them. Doesn't tell us that they permitted them to still live with them. Doesn't tell us that they sent them home to their families outside. We don't know the relationship. What we do know is how they handled it is they went to the law of God. They understood what the law of God was very clear, and they said, let's deal with everything on a case-by-case basis, individually. We don't just condemn the whole group because of some unfortunate situation. You don't condemn a group of people because of some perceived action. You take everything case by case, which they did. Ezra found the sins to be deep-seated all the way to Jeshua, the high priest, who was defiled because of who they had living in their household, his children. Ezra stuck with the law. They applied the law. They had much cleanup work to do, which is why we can understand how Israel could never get things going and never get things built up when they had the blessing of God. It took a long time for them to get things built in 520 BC. Finally went back to work and got things built. Going along, but you can imagine, you take the high priest and you go back into Jerusalem, and then you start off on the wrong foot. That's why it was so important getting Ezra there, who really understood the law, who taught it well, and he brought it in, and it was tough. It was like putting iodine on a wound. It burns, but it heals. I did not know what sin was until I heard the law. But when I did, I now know what it takes to get aligned with my God and pursue His blessing. Not my own desires and not my flesh. Well, that's what we see out of Ezra, chapters 1 to 10. We've gone through that, and we're now at 457 BC, and we start the book of Nehemiah, tomorrow's devotion. We're going to start now about 13 years ahead, from 457 now to 444 BC in Nehemiah chapter 1. We'll see you there tomorrow.